All right, welcome everybody to our second session. We're going to kick things off with reflections on Clyde Barrow's The Dangerous Class and on Barrow's lecture from last week with Donald Parkinson. So take it away, Donald.
All right. Hey guys, it's exciting to be here. Thought last week's lecture went great, and it was a very interesting discussion afterwards. And I kind of just wrote up a few random thoughts that I had, trying to understand what exactly the Lumpen proletariat is, and try to understand what exactly is the way that we politically intervene in relation to the Lumpen proletariat and class struggle. And I kind of came up with this idea that maybe, Kautsky is wrong that the Lumpen proletariat is entirely separate from the proletariat proper. And maybe it makes more sense to see the Lumpen rather as a section of the proletariat. And I'll go into explaining this more. But so basically, for Marx and Engels, every historical mode of production has a Lumpen proletariat. There's a class structure that forms, and then you have the margins of the people outside of the class structure who are not engaged in any real relation to production within this class structure. So they essentially have a parasitic relationship to the broader mode of production. And so capitalism is no exception. But the issue is that capitalism is a unique mode of production, in that it's based off the dispossession of the direct producers. It's based on throwing the direct producers out of the production process to increase labor productivity through raising organic composition of capital. And in the process of, proletarianization, it separates the direct producers from the means of production, specifically like self-subsistent peasants, for example, in the process of primitive accumulation. So capitalism it's always searching for a profit, and it's always creating this pool of dispossessed potential sellers of labor power. And in order for capitalism to function, it has to be able to have a large pool of dispossessed labor powers that can be hired and fired at will. So you got to have a little bit of unemployment. Like, technically in bourgeois economics, full employment does not mean 100% employment. It means 95% employment, because the idea is that, as capital continuously is driving to improve the production process, you have to be able to fire workers at will and hire new ones as necessary in order to be able to change production processes, at will. And so essentially capitalism is always throwing people out of relation. It's always denying people a relationship to the means of production in order to create the possibility of a proletariat. And so you have historians such as Peter Linebaugh and Hobsbawm who talk about these kind of early periods of capitalism. Well, we have these freshly, minted dispossessed farmers. And when you have these farmers who are dispossessed, the first thing that they go to is not the factory to go work. The first thing they tend to become is vagabonds. And so essentially, but capitalism is creating the proletariat in its early days. It's also creating the Lumpen proletariat. And the same people who are part of this Lumpen proletariat are the same people who are going to be the normal proletariat, so to speak. It's just they're in a different moment of the overall process of class formation. And so I think it kind of makes sense for us to see the proletariat as this broader pool of dispossessed individuals that can become the potential, that are either potential or are sellers of labor power. And what makes the proletariat is more so the dispossession aspect. It's more so the propertyless aspect. And it's because that, this whole pool of laborers has no stake in the existing property regime that, it has nothing to lose. It has more to lose than There's nothing more to lose than its change. Exactly. So, but then you ask the question, like, why does this not apply, to the Lumpen proletariat? They're also dispossessed. They don't own property. And so I think that we have a problem here, because technically, lumpen proletarians are still proletarians, but nonetheless, there is an undeniable historical tendency for this section to become a tool of reactionary intrigue. So maybe what we need to do is we need to kind of look at the proletariat as a broader class that has an upper limit and a lower limit. And the upper limit is commonly understood to be the labor aristocracy. And I find this interesting because Marx and Engels bring up this theory of the labor aristocracy, saying that you have this better paid and more secure section of the proletariat, and they're complaining that this section of the proletariat is essentially bought out by the bourgeoisie, and that they're essentially paid off by the profits of imperialism. But at the same time, they see like the lower, proletariat, the lumpen proletariat, the most ragged and dispossessed and beaten down section of, this class is essentially reactionary. And so what you get is basically Marx and Engels are looking for this kind of unskilled mass proletariat that is neither lumpen proletariat nor is it labor aristocracy. And it's essentially kind of the center of the proletariat that Marx and Engels are kind of looking towards. And so I think the question is how do we create a proletarian subject that is able to unite all these different sections of the proletariat so that the upper limit, the labor aristocracy, and the lower limit, the lumpen proletariat, do not become reactionary players who see themselves as separate from the broader proletariat. And I think it's important to look at the whole process of class formation here, because usually when we talk about class formation, we're thinking of a purely economic process where we're just creating a population with a certain relationship to the means of production. But there's also an organizational and political aspect to class formation. There's the process through which all these different economic locations organize themselves into various institutions, and then organize around the political program to go from a class in itself to a class for itself. And so what I'm kind of thinking here is this process of class formation is a process of trying to find a way to prevent the lumpen proletariat from going over the side of reaction and win them over to the hegemony of the broader unskilled proletariat, and to do the same with the labor aristocracy. And I want to bring a historical example into this because I think this is actually a problem that the left has faced before. In the German Revolution of 1918, for example, you have the proletariat is it's already divided by nationality, sexuality, skill, etc., etc. But I think that in the German Revolution, this division of the lumpen, what I call the mass unskilled proletariat, and the labor aristocracy is really obvious because you can see it in the bases of the different left-wing workers' parties in Germany. For example, you have the KPD, the Spartacus League, and later it would split in the KPD. And now this was essentially a party that was fueled by the lumpen proletariat in its early days. Like in the early days of the Spartacus revolt, for example, a lot of the more moderate workers who were members of the SPD and even the USPD basically saw the Spartacists as a bunch of lumpen proletarian agitators. And they did have what would be called, the lumpen proletariat in their ranks quite a bit. They had quite a few unemployed workers, quite a few demobilized soldiers. And it so happened that, these added an energy of desire for insurrection, immediate revolution right then, right now. And so a lot of the more labor aristocratic workers who you would find in the SPD, in the ranks of the SPD, and also the USPD, which was kind of like the in between the two. SPD would be the most conservative workers' party that kind of is based in the labor aristocracy, but also has it has a lot of the unskilled proletariat. But generally, they look down on the lumpen. They look to the Spartacist League and the revolutionary workers movements as lumpen proletarians. And whereas the Communist Party sees the workers in the SPD as essentially a bunch of Mensheviks who have been essentially brainwashed by social democracy into giving up on revolution. So you have, what I'm saying here is you have like a political divide in the working class in 1918 Germany that I think is representative of a broader divide within the composition of the proletariat according to these different locations, such as the Lumpen proletariat. And I think part of the failure of the German left in this period was their inability to develop a political apparatus and a program that would find a way to essentially unite these different sections of the proletariat. And I think when you fail to do this, what happens is that you have the boundaries of the proletariat are always kind of being redrawn, in my opinion. And so I think when you have a section of the proletariat that is alienated from the broader proletarian movement, that leads it to essentially become what we see as the reactionary lumpen. And I think going forward, I think what we need to be looking at is how can we develop a political program and organizing activities that will prevent the lumpen proletariat from going over to the side of, reaction. I think one thing I was thinking about was kind of the unemployment councils that the CPUSA was running in the 1930s. These were actually some of its most important organizing activities, but it was primarily, it was unemployed workers. It was not organizing at the point of production. And I imagine like a lot of these people were probably seen as lumpen. And so I think the question is, how do we find a way to prevent the lumpen proletariat from going over to this side of reactionary intrigue? And how do we solve these broader divisions within the class? And that's all I gotta say for now.
Excellent. Very nice. I want to open up with a question, Donald, about the Spartacist uprising. My reading is that it was destined to fail because of two main reasons. I wonder if you agree with this. One was a lack of tactical leadership that the Russian Bolsheviks had, like I'm talking military leadership,
right?
And the status of the German state military apparatus was just simply much more robust than what the Tsarist regime had. That's one. Then the other one was, yeah, like you said, like a very clumsy coalition that was formed. And I know Bramler, the guy who was actually the formal leader, was a bricklayer. So he came from kind of like an industrial working class thing, but by no means. And then of course there's that glorious story that we read about in Trotsky's biography of how because Trotsky could speak German, he was called upon to go and lead the insurrection on the ground.
Yeah,
but,
1923.
But Stalin prevented it from happening, tragically. So, and I'm not like some Trotskyist who's going to suggest that, oh, everything would have fallen into place. I think that would be a silly argument. But could you talk a little bit more about maybe like what failed at the level of like Lumpen proletariat solidarity, maybe, in that you probably have studied it more than most of us, perhaps?
Yeah, I honestly think the problem is that the majority of the working class did not see the need for a further revolution. That there was a revolution or it was a democratic revolution in Germany, and the SPD was seen as the leaders of it. And we just had to face the reality that the majority of the working class was still loyal to the SPD at this time. And so in their mind, the SPD was already doing the revolution. And so, you did have a more militant and radical section of the working class who were drawn towards the Spartacists, who had already been drawn towards the USPD, which was kind of it was like the anti-war members of the SPD who had yet to completely split. And so I think the issue was that maybe the lumpen composition of the Spartacist and this kind of more revolutionary layer of the proletariat, they had, the revolutionary drive and the ambition, but they didn't have the patience, because there was this sense that we needed to fight for communism now. You know, a lot of these workers were members of the KPD. They were demobilized soldiers. They had just gotten back from World War I. They had saw, you know, the bloodshed. It is apocalyptic type scenario, and you know they have nothing to lose. And so the idea is, what are we waiting for? We need to go and pick up our guns and do what the Russians did right now, because you know this is our time. This is necessary. You know, the world revolution is happening, and so I think it was a lack of revolutionary patience. I think one thing that the Bolsheviks had, not just the military leadership, but they also had the ability to better test the waters of the masses and figure out where they are. I think they were better at incorporating, you know, these more lumpen proletarian elements along with the more traditional working class, as well as winning over elements of the labor aristocracy. And so I think that you know, in the Spartacist revolutions, ultimately I think the Spartacist revolution failed just because there wasn't enough popular support for another revolution. And I think that maybe if they had instead waited and focused on building up their forces, so that in 1920, when the Kop Putsch happened, they could have mobilized to prevent the putsch, they should put themselves in a better position of popularity amongst the working class, and from there they might be able to make a better bid for revolution. Instead, in 1921, there was the March Action, which was essentially a putsch that went terrible. And I think almost like thousands of KPD members left the organization. So there was just this putschist tendency in the party. And I don't think you can entirely blame it on a lumpen proletariat composition. I think as the party went on, I think it started to become a bit less lumpen. But you definitely had like putschist tendencies that were alienating a lot of the workers from the party. In 1923, when they wanted to send over Trotsky, I am undecided on how much of that was a real revolutionary possibility. The German October is what they called it. And I think I would just have to do more research, honestly. I honestly don't know enough to say. I know that I think Brandler did say that it was a revolutionary possibility that failed because of poor tactics. But don't take my word for that. But yeah, I think that's harder to say. But I definitely think that part of the problem was that there was this kind of impatient putschist element in the Spartacist / KPD that kind of led to a strategy that was bound to alienate the majority of the working class. And the solution, I'm not exactly sure.
That's helpful. Frank, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Donald, nice presentation. Thanks for that. I'm kind of thinking about something that Clyde Barrow said last seminar regarding the Lumpen proletariat as a social category and not so much a class from his perspective. And this kind of placing this alongside something you said, Daniel, regarding lumpenization or lumpen proletarianization as a verb rather than a sort of ontological category or noun. I wonder then, Donald, do you see lumpen proletarianization if it really is a social category, and a category is, it's a function, right? A function of organization is what a category is. Are we looking at lumpen proletarianization and the lumpen proletariat then more as a function? And if so, a crucial function in the very, that's at work in the processes of class formation? And if so, what might that, how would that affect, or how might that impact, I guess, the class struggle itself? How is the class struggle, how is it inflected by the functionalism of the lumpen proletariat?
Right. I think with classes, you can't look at them as just kind of static entities. Because, for example, you have people who are wage workers, you know, who are like total classic, you know, productive laborers in the Marxist sense, but they might be involved in illegal activities of various kinds to supplement their income. And you say that person is a normal proletariat, or are they a lumpen proletariat, or are they maybe someone in the process of being lumpenized, or is it not even worth thinking about class in terms of individuals, but maybe broader social processes in the division of labor? And I think with lumpenization, it is built into it's built into the capitalist system. And I actually don't really know if I think like it's completely incidental to capitalist system. So like I said, you have to be constantly creating this this surplus army of labor in order to have a pool of labor power that you can hire and fire from. And so the creation of a lumpen proletariat is always going to happen in capitalism because you need to keep a certain pool of labor power, you know, as dispossessed as possible. And eventually a certain section of that unemployed is going to fall into, you know, a life of crime, a life of, they're no longer going to be in the workforce. They're going to find other ways of subsisting their income, of subsistence and finding an income. And so maybe it is better to think of the lumpen proletariat as a process, as one of the moments in the broader formation of the proletariat, rather than it's because you can't talk about class categories like they're static categories. Like because the boundaries of these classes are always being reshaped, and they're always being redrawn.
And I wonder, I wonder if the redrawing and the reshaping, I agree with you. I think classes, and maybe I would say even we shouldn't conflate class with category insofar as like class is the result of categorization. And I agree, class does have boundaries and borders that tend to take different shape, and they're permeable, and they're under flux themselves. But I do wonder to what degree is the lumpen proletarianization itself, if that is really a function at play or a process at play in that shaping or reshaping of the sort of inert system of classes or the collection of classes. And you mentioned that Marx and Engels addresses that every historical mode of production has its lumpen. So that also raises the specter of a sort of, at first blush, kind of in the vulgar sense, transhistoricism of this lumpen proletarianization. So the question then is, well, what are the conditions that allow for the continuity of that very form, the survival of that form across different historical modes of production? And I wonder if Barrow said something last seminar about the lumpen are often used instrumentally, right? So again, back to this idea of a function that can be used or applied in perhaps the manipulation of the class system. And what then are the conditions that allow for the lumpen as a function to exist, especially if it does cut across not just class categories, but also different modes of production? I wonder if there's something regarding the objectification of people here too. I'm thinking of something that Badu once said at a lecture that I saw him at. He said that exploitation is the level of the object, domination is at the level of the subject. And so if we have this exploitation of people in this form of lumpen proletariat, I wonder to what degree are we seeing an actual objectification process happening under the name of lumpen proletarianization, and that's at play in the shaping of the class system.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is essentially how the lumpen proletariat is created by capital, not just economically, but also politically. Like specific populations are criminalized. You know, they're purposely beaten down into submission. And you see this the most with the complete criminalization of the Black American proletariat, as well as the immigrant proletariat. But you also see the lumpenization of the white proletariat. And so I think what's going on here is part of the function of the lumpen proletariat in the eyes of capital is to use it as a weapon against the working class, to kind of create lumpenized sections of the population and play them against each other in order to create resentments, to create ethnic, racial conflicts, to essentially prevent any kind of class politics from really developing. I think as you play the lumpen Black workers against the skilled white workers, but what I'm trying to think is, so if capital purposely creates the lumpen proletariat and lumpenizes populations in this process of class struggle, how can the Communist Party kind of do the same thing? How can we instead take these lumpenized sections of the proletariat and win them over into a program of class solidarity? So I think it's the function of the lumpen proletariat and what function is in a given social formation is going to be contested by the political forces at play. And I think right now, when, you know, the left being so incredibly weak, that its function is entirely dominated by the needs of the capitalist class right now. But I hope that kind of answers what you're going for.
Yeah, thank you, Donald.
Great. Matthew.
Yeah, I had a few sort of things to make note of. One is that I think it's significant or interesting that Marx and Engels use the language of buying off to refer to both the labor aristocracy and the lumpen proletariat. You know, labor aristocracy through you know, dominating the world market and being able to provide special benefits, especially in Britain, and then with the lumpen proletariat by organizing them in the Mobile Guard or later the Society of the 10th December. And so that language of buying off, yeah, I think does involve the sort of the making the lumpen proletariat into a tool that you're using, and I think sort of works well with Donald's interpretation. And so I'm wondering then if the idea, you know, so then I think if they are being utilized by the bourgeoisie in that way, then I think it makes sense to have the sort of proletarian party, the goal to be to exert hegemony over this stratum. And then with the idea of the lumpenization as like a social function or a category that plays a role, then that makes me think that maybe that there's the question of delumpenization, which I know Donald raised to Professor Barrow, who said that he didn't really think delumpenization was necessary. But I do think that we might entertain an idea of delumpenization through class struggle, the way that Kautsky talked about upskilling through class struggle, where workers would learn how to run trade unions, political parties, campaigns, and this would be sort of preparatory for learning how to take power. Maybe we could consider a notion of delumpenization through class struggle, and I think maybe that's what Donald was talking about in the last lecture. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. I think you hit the nail on the head with the buying off aspect, because it's like Marx doesn't want the workers to be too immiserated, because then they'll be lumpenized and it'll be easy for demagogues to buy them off. But he doesn't want them to be too comfortable either, because then, you know, the bourgeois can buy them off and with their imperialist super profit. So he kind of wants workers to be kind of like in between the two situations. It's kind of interesting actually how, you know, how that works. But I think we need to look at, like, what is it about the lumpen proletariat that like makes them easy to buy off for reactionaries? Is it because they're involved in certain types of criminal activity that are harmful to other proletarians often, that therefore limits the amount of solidarity that they can have? I think that's a factor. I think it's the fact that, you know, they're so completely immiserated that they rely on state aid, which makes them susceptible to various kind of patronage networks of various kind of demagogic populist type figures. And so I think when we're talking about the lumpen proletariat, it's almost hard for me to see it as a one unified section that you can make any kind of complete claims about, because I feel like, you know, the average prostitute and the pimp and the prostitute don't have the same, you know, they don't have the same life. The drug dealer and a drug addict, they don't have the same life. They're not engaged in the same kind of economic activity to survive. And so it's kind of like we have to look in the lumpen proletariat for these kind of divisions maybe, and try to take advantage of those, and try to look at, you know, what are the situations within the life of the lumpen proletariat that lead to reactionary intrigue, and how can we intervene to instead lead to, you know, potential radicalization. And I don't have easy answers about this. I really don't, but I do think that there is a history of communists organizing lumpen proletarians and turning them into class fighters.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, so I guess we can move on to our next, unless anyone has another comment or a question for Donald, but we can move on to our next one. I wonder, maybe I should go next, Crisanto, in part because I know your reflections are kind of more
testimonial.
open-ended and more, yeah, like more about the Brazilian scene in particular, and which is very different than the American scene in many ways. And mine's kind of more theory-based, and maybe we'll hopefully get at some of the questions that Donald raised. So I'm just going to read this. Hopefully it won't go for too long. And feel free to stop me literally at any point with clarification questions or anything that you like. So currently my title is The Honest Lumpen Proletariat and the Double. So in some sense, to name any class Lumpen Proletariat is to reveal something that would otherwise prefer to stay hidden. The Lumpen Proletariat is not merely defined by its, quote, non-relation to production, which is perhaps the most common definition of it. It's also an alliance and a class formation with an element of the ruling class. It is therefore a tendency of parasitism and disillusion. That is, Lumpen Proletariat is also a verb that refers to a process of lumpenization as a particular mode or particular way of decomposition within a class that's not only reducible to the proletariat. That's a key point I wish to make tonight. Clyde Barrow suggests the Lumpen Proletariat is an economic, a cultural, and social as well as political category. He proposes an expansive definition of the category in Marxist thought. Economically, the Lumpen Proletariat are the excess effects of accumulation cycles, as well as a particular class formation that comes about amidst crisis in capitalism. The very nature of this crisis is both economic as well as representational. So the crisis emerges in the spheres of capital, nation, and state, to employ the more comprehensive framework of the Marxist philosopher Kojun Karatani. Barrow further suggests that we should not think of Lumpen Proletariat as a pejorative term, but as a descriptive category that tells us something about the way that Bonapartist political figures such as Trump emerge. So we have an economic emergence of a Lumpen class, which is structural, and Barrow finds support for this, although they're not named outright, in volume 1, chapter 25 of Capital, on accumulation cycles, where we discover the conditions that bring the Lumpen Proletariat as a surplus population into existence is part of capital valuation cycles as such. Therefore, in its economic definition, the Lumpen is crucially defined by its non-relation to productive labor. And this is what distinguishes Lumpens from proletarians, who are defined more generally by their dependence on productive labor. Lumpen Proletariat is also a vital political actor in Marx and Engels' political writings, from the 18th to Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And in other work, Engels especially identifies Lumpen Proletariat all the way back to the Roman Empire and before, as Frank was mentioning earlier. So as a political class, or more precisely as a non-class or decomposed class, the Lumpen Proletariat are curiously referred to by Marx and Engels also as a moral category. In essence, it is those Lumpens who have one foot in labor or a certain minimal proximity to productive labor. They are the ones that display less of a potential for a parasitic alliance with the finance aristocracy. And they are the ones who demonstrate less of a tendency to be made into fascists. These are what Marx and Engels call honest Lumpens. And they therefore help us begin to think of precisely what Donald was asking, which is a possible alliance with the proletariat. The title honest Lumpen also helps us to sort of shrug off the pejorative and demeaning associations that Lumpen Proletariat generally has as a category in Marxist thought, given they're often described as scum or criminals or knaves. I argue that honest Lumpen Proletariat is actually not a useful rhetorical label, but remains helpful as an analytic category because it helps us to identify a block of Lumpen support and solidarity that can be congruent with proletarian goals. It also helps us to avoid discarding the entirety of Lumpens as reactionary or as exclusively prone to becoming bribed tools of reactionary intrigue. To the contrary, by better understanding the emergence and better understanding the tendencies of Lumpens, we can come to see that they present a vector of proletarian organizing that is very helpful for navigating the status of the sphere of the state in particular. It is, after all, far more precise to refer to the huge surplus populations, and for this we can name just a few of the general tendencies of this category. These include contingent laborers, a wide swath of service sector employees with tenuous contracts, the structurally unemployed, which is way more common in the peripheral regions than in the core, but still common in the core regions, as well as the bloated retiree populations living in state-supported poverty programs. These are what we might call the honest lumpen proletariat. And without invoking this moral distinction between the honest lumpen and the kind of lumpen of scoundrels, we can't really differentiate how lumpenization actually leads to fascism, in my opinion. So I think that we must maintain this moral distinction, but be careful about how we deploy it rhetorically. In other words, in socialist organizing circles, it doesn't really make sense to define oneself as an honest lumpen. It sounds a little cheesy. Yet, as an analytic category, it's absolutely essential. Now, the honest lumpen, as Barrow writes in chapter 6 of his book, The Lumpenproletariat, Communism or Dystopia, ? Is fundamentally bound up with surplus populations. Again, because of the semi or partial relation they have to productive labor. As a result, the honest lumpen poses a more subtle and confused threat to proletarian political goals because they do not define their political interests vis-a-vis labor-based ends. They're rather more prone to construing politics vis-a-vis gender, age, race, nationality, ethnicity, locality, sexuality, and lifestyle categories, as opposed to being defined as a worker. In each of these expressions, political claims are advanced from social locations which are uncoupled from class positions and other identities defined by participation in the labor market. Now, Barrow points out that the cleavages opened by the dynamics of these kind of largely identity movements or identity politics in a broad sense are not negotiable within a distributive framework, precisely because these social identities are not defined by distributive positions within the labor market or by any places within the social relations of production, okay? This means that appeals to welfare state support, which the honest lumpen already receives, albeit through a minimal and austerity dictated state distribution apparatus, it is these welfare state policies and proposals which become very appealing sites of emancipation for the honest lumpen. But importantly, these are demands which are state-governed areas of life, and they're not necessarily contingent upon labor organization. It is therefore important that we not forget that the working day is, after all, a legal and not merely an economic law, which means that state policy and state power is a primary vector for fulfilling honest lumpen as well as proletarian or working class demands. This fact that hugely important areas of proletarian struggle, such as the legal definition and limits imposed on the working day, are defined by the state and not by the labor market, makes the honest lumpen a crucial partner to any proletarian project. However, these surplus populations of the honest lumpen have only an implicit demand for things like greater leisure time and for less work, because they, and rather they're not formulated in an explicit format. And it's a debate to the extent to which proletarians actually have implicit strong demands for greater leisure time or anti-workerist politics. Perhaps we can discuss that. But I think it's definitely the case for honest lumpens that there is an absence of demands for political liberation or emancipation, which would take on a distinctive worker orientation. And this, I think, is the case because of the neoliberalization of precarity work, and the honest lumpen has been reduced to what the anonymous radical left collective Tukun calls the needy opportunist. So they propose that for the surplus populations, we can't really define them as workers. We actually could, it's more accurate to define them as needy opportunists. Why is that? That is because when labor is, or a job is presented as a viable option, if you've ever interacted with true Lumpen populations, it's very difficult to find a job at Walmart. It's very difficult to find a part-time job. And much of this is tied to the carceral state for the Black Lumpen population, because there are laws in the vast majority of states which mean that if you have a record, a criminal record, you cannot get formal work. So you're structurally forced into the black market. So therefore, the very site of labor becomes a site of contradiction for them in some sense. Now, Barrow points out that for post-Marxists, such as Andre Gortz, the surplus populations imply that the only viable path to something resembling a communist revolution in the future could only occur within the welfare state, wherein communism would be gradually absorbed into the state apparatus as a result of crisis conditions that the surplus populations are facing. Namely, in a need, especially with climate change and global pandemics, surplus populations will so visibly and so obviously be thrown out on a limb that large-scale state intervention at some point will become a necessity. Although looking at the kind of social Darwinistic situation in the United States, especially with Texas, that may not necessarily be true, at least in terms of how the state would see the surplus humanity. Now, Klaus Off, who is another post-Marxist, similarly describes surplus populations as what he calls policy takers, because the place they occupy within the social division of labor and consumption is policy determined rather than economically determined. And here's a quote from Gortz. He says, "Surplus populations have no transcendent unity or mission, and hence no overall conception of history or society. Their disconnection from labor markets make the very contours," and I think this is a very crucial point for us to realize, "make the very contours of post-industrial socialism libertarian." The honest Lumpen makes socialism libertarian and overly policy focused. Now, this sounds very familiar to the DSA, or at least elements of some aspects of DSA. So there is a certain sense in which the honest Lumpen is actually very much already informing the very platform of how we construe of socialism today, okay? One massive sector of the honest Lumpen I wanna just raise with you are the elderly. Now, many of your parents are probably already facing this, which is the structure of Medicare and the structure of Medicaid means that in order to retire, the state requires you to live at a below poverty level. So you have to pauperize yourself in order to become eligible for state privatized retired living, which is absolutely hell on earth. I mean, the status of these retirement communities during the pandemic have been kind of quasi-genocidal in some sense. So it's something we can discuss. Now, what's the other side of the Lumpen? The other side of the Lumpen moral divide is obviously the reactionary Lumpen. Marx and Engels called the knaves and the scoundrels. Now, these reactionary Lumpens are marked by a particular nostalgia. So they have a particular relation to the past. And specifically, that relation to the past is petty bourgeois. And the petty bourgeois lifestyle becomes, like Barrow said, almost a utopia of a Jeffersonian dimension of small business owners and kind of a general libertarian form of social organization. Now, it is these Lumpens that Barrow links to Trumpism as the active, quote unquote, clown show dimension of Trumpism by virtue of their non-relation to production. They have a tendency to form an alliance with the parasitic finance aristocracy within the bourgeoisie. And we should note both subject positions, the finance aristocracy of bourgeoisie and the kind of former industrial proletarian Lumpen, now here we're thinking of white working class and all of that, both have a non-relation to production. So Marx's original definition still, as a general theory, holds, okay? I think one of the best analyses of Trumpism, or I think more specifically Bannonism, because Bannonism was the true engine of the organization of the Trump coalition, was that much of the knaves and the scoundrels actually come from the former industrial proletarian base of the conservative hard hat Nixonian coalition, which has sort of lived on almost as a kind of vampiric existence today, right? It's very personal for me to talk about this because these are my family. These are my, this is where I come from. I'm sure many of you come from similar backgrounds. Now, Barrow suggests that the white proletariat class has undergone lumpenization, split between the petty bourgeois clown show, which means that these are real petty bourgeois individuals, small business owners, real estate owners. These are the people, the element of 1/6 who have some private inherited wealth or, you know, something like a connection to petty bourgeois lifestyle, okay? But then there's also, and I think Barrow was suggesting an almost ontological status of lumpen that's also part of Trumpism, which is like a true sort of lumpen white working class, which is truly dispossessed, right? And it's this combination which makes the kind of toxic fascistic cocktail of Trumpism, right? So I want to now shift and talk about what lumpenization is as a verb, right? What is it that makes the petty bourgeois clown show have a relation to the finance aristocrat? Is actually, I think, a very interesting theory of what I'm calling a doubling. And so the double is a way for me to think about lumpenization as a kind of procedure on social political identities, right? In this way, lumpenization is a farcical operation that can occur within any class. So therefore, we can think about it as the honest lumpen is a clown show of the proletariat, abandoning its form of labor-oriented solidarity in favor of appeals to other categories of moral concern, such as gender, race, and other. Now, that's not to say that the proletariat is not concerned with those categories, but it is to say that elements of the honest lumpen proletariat are actually hostile to labor forms of organizing. And I think we saw this in the fact that the Bernie Sanders campaign actually did not identify, it was the honest lumpen did not identify with Sanders specifically through the lens of labor as such. I think we should be honest about that, right? So that was a form of a doubling. Another form of doubling is the way in which the parasitic finance aristocrat becomes a kind of clown show double of the so-called globalist or G8 finance aristocrat, or kind of with their fancy suit and their kind of Ivy League education. They're basically attending the same conferences. They're on the same team, but they have a kind of a distance from one another. We should remember this division already occurred before the election of Joe Biden. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, already embraced the Black Lives Matter protests in the spring of 2020 and advocated, in fact, that corporate elites and financial groups adopt a proactive corporate affirmative action strategy to begin to radically, basically save their asses on a symbolic level so that the bourgeoisie might get ahead of the BLM protest movement. Now, this symbolic and corporate shift coincided with millions of dollars donated to BLM and a quick and earnest campaign to win over the discourse of youthful demands that were kicked up by this protest movement. So what this indicates is a kind of counter tendency on behalf of a certain wing of finance aristocracy within the bourgeoisie, what we might call, or what Marx and Engels called the party of order, turning against the parasitic finance class of Trump, right? And I think it's also useful to note that the fact that this alliance of turning against Trump happened before November already showed the winds of change within the bourgeoisie, that they were done with Trump long before that. So my next section is called Crisis of Representation, the Bonapartists and the Lumpen Plug the Hole. So I want to turn now to a theory of lumpenization as a verb, which is actually provided by the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. In his book, The Philosopher and His Poor, published in 1983, Rancière theorizes the historical emergence of lumpenization as a general process of decomposition or intra-class fragmentation that really started during the time of Louis Bonaparte III and the great worker uprisings of 1848. Rancière argues that a particular form of lumpenization emerged not from the proletariat, but from the bourgeoisie. It is the active lumpenizing process that has come to shape the very way class struggle and class is even defined in a Marxist sense for Rancière. So lumpenization is kind of the secret to the way that the later Marx will treat class struggle, according to Rancière. Lumpenization for Rancière represents a process of decomposition endemic to any class. It is what happens to a class as it undergoes a kind of the process that Marx referred to in the 18th of Brumaire of the Lumpenproletariat as this kind of notion of a sack of potatoes. In other words, lumpenization is when a class acts outside of its own coherent platform of social and political interests and reveals itself as composed of atomized individuals seeking their own wealth and so on. So lumpenization is thus what happens when a class faces crisis and attempts to conserve itself. So Rancière makes an almost psychoanalytic point that the very notion of conservation of a class kicks up lumpenization. Therefore, the class's coherency and the class's strategic, social, and political are undermined by the class itself. A quote from Rancière, he says, "Every class, insofar as it defends its own social interest, is virtually its own lumpen to itself. The bourgeoisie as a class continually falls short of achieving their political interests, and they fail to secure their social interests. And it is this internal lack of unity within the bourgeoisie that permits them to act like a sack of potatoes." And this erosion erodes also the very grounds of the normative discipline that the bourgeoisie is able to exert. So it is in these conditions of a kind of frayed normative ground caused by lumpenization in which you have a Bonapartist figure emerge. So lumpenization is thus a process of doubling of a class, doubling almost I want to think of as a kind of identity movement, which I'm going to explain more. And for Rancière, again, it's not something which is necessarily starting from kind of former or sub-proletarians, but is actually starting within the bourgeoisie itself, which I think is an interesting claim, which we can talk about. To support this claim, he says, if you look at the Mobile Guard of Louis Bonaparte, he says that, in fact, they were not composed of lumpens. They were composed of the kind of rich brats of the bourgeoisie who kind of led a bohemian life. I mean, keep in mind that at the time, the decadence of the ruling class was such that aesthetically, even Bonaparte himself was a bohemian, right? So you can kind of have an outward appearance of a marginal other, even though you're actually from the bourgeoisie. So I think that's a very helpful point. And here's another quote from Rancière. He says, "It is the process of decomposition whereby the bourgeois class undoes itself and becomes an aggregate of atoms living at their own expense. The ruling bourgeoisie proves itself to be what it is, not the force incarnate of modern industry, but simply a mob of individuals eager to fulfill their purse by any means." Okay. Now, post-1848, Rancière argues that this situation of the lumpenization of the bourgeoisie actually went to affirm a paradoxical dominance of the bourgeois social order as such. And it was in this context in which Bonaparte emerges. Why? Well, he emerges precisely because he was the unrepresentable node, right, who could plug the hole of the crisis without actually having a coherent ideological stake that was able to be represented on any of the political spectrums or sides of the aisle. Now, I think it's interesting to note here that Trump himself kind of echoed that Bonapartist ideological incoherence, right, or sort of plasticity, right? but only up until he got elected. I mean, it's very, very obvious to most of us that he really was a kind of mainstream Republican. But I think that there was a moment that people really were duped that he was a kind of ideological Bonapartist figure. Okay, anyways. So the crisis of 1848, therefore, was not merely economic, but rather extended to the heart of the crisis within the wider nation-state capital nexus. And it was therefore should be thought of as a representational crisis, a crisis of democracy, a crisis of culture, a crisis also of economics, and so on. So my question then is, does lumpenization cause this system-wide crisis, or is it merely an effect of it? Now, I think the question of cause and effect of lumpenization to this crisis of representation is less clear in Rancière's theory of lumpenization. Rancière does argue that all of society responded to this crisis with a bourgeois triumph, and that the doubling and the fragmentation of each class resulted in a world of what we might call a total bourgeois character. Now, it was this tragic outcome of a world totally governed by the bourgeoisie, but governed by the bourgeoisie in a paradoxical sense, insofar as the very normative substratum of their governance had no legitimacy, but retained power, right? Now, for Rancière, he says something very nice about how Marx thought of the proletariat in this specific context, which is that if everything is bourgeois, one, there's nothing outside of it, and two, the proletariat must be thought of as a specific procedure of coming into existence which avoids lumpenization. So that's actually a point that I gained from Rancière, which I actually see present in other Althusserian schools of Marxist thought, which I think we might be able to tease out when we talk about this. He says famously, the proletariat needs the science of capital in order to exist, not merely to become educated about the value form. So without the book of Capital, bourgeois society would persist with its masquerade of fakeness and decadence and doubles, i.e., bourgeois society is a society of a kind of perpetual lumpenization. That is, liberalism is also a society of atomized individuals constantly re-atomizing and foreclosing class solidarity. Now, this formulation of a total bourgeois-dominated society is one sustained by lumpenization, is not merely a structural economic condition, but it's also, as I said a moment ago, a tendency which proletarians must avoid. And this is why I think if we look at the category that Marx introduces of the social individual in the Grundrisse, I've actually been trying to piece together a few different readings of how we think about this category, because on the one hand, there's a certain tendency to read the social individual as the sort of cumulative effects of the project, good night, honey, the project of liberal bourgeois individualism with all of its exclusions and its kind of relations of domination, also providing the kind of paradoxical grounds for a truer coming into fruition of a more communistic individual. That's one reading. Rancière is giving us a different reading, and I think so is Sartre and so is Badiou. And it's in these readings where we find the idea that class struggle is really about a kind of total revolution against bourgeois society as such, which is why in Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre will talk about the seriality of social existence. Or in Logics of Worlds, Badiou will also discuss kind of contemporary capitalism in a similar modality, which is contemporary capitalism is composed of kind of atonal social relations, which foreclose the possibility of eventual decisions, i.e., it's a world in which the proletariat's existence is precisely not permitted to appear, right? So you have this sort of notion that the proletariat is actually not an ontological category within the order of appearance of bourgeois society, but it's something that only actively comes through the force of revolution, right? So I think these are two ways to read Marx's social individual that I'm actually continuing to research. I also will say that I think Roland Barthes' claim that the bourgeoisie is the one class which can be defined as its, on the basis of its refusal to be defined as a class, very much supports Rancière's thesis that lumpenization begins with the bourgeoisie, okay? I think it's also important to note the way in which Marx and Engels will lean on certain strands of literature during the post-Bonapartist time, particularly Balzac. Engels wrote of Balzac, "I've learned more in his writings than from all the professed historians, economists, and statisticians of the period combined." And he says it was Balzac's writings that formed a constant elegy on the inevitable decay of good society. So these pessimistic and reactionary accounts of a bourgeois society that you find in Balzac are interesting to us because they sort of affirm the idea that the problem of lumpenization was the problem of a kind of bourgeois social order that can kind of exist ad infinitum without a normative basis of appeal or of efficacy, right? And I think this is something which really resonates with our current so-called crisis of liberalism, right? I mean, even the New York Times on a daily basis embarrasses itself, right? I mean, it's very obvious that the kind of spokespeople of the ruling class have, in many cases, like fully lost their efficacy to kind of compel people to be disciplined by their demands, right? So you have a kind of feralization of the proletariat under these conditions, okay? And then, you know, Rancière actually talks a lot about this is actually why artists and why like a thinker like Bertolt Brecht becomes extremely important to Marxist thought. Because if the proletariat is thought in this way as a kind of inexistent body, it actually must utilize aesthetics as kind of weapons for self-invention, right? And so things like the public sphere become crucial sites for contesting this kind of decadent bourgeois social order, right? So in the next section, I want to turn to Karatani's reading of the 18th of Brumaire, where he writes that the Lumpen proletariat emerged as a non-class founded on a contentless discourse. So for Karatani, the Lumpen proletariat is a mirror of what he calls the crisis of representation. And they come about to plug the hole in this crisis. Now, importantly, the Lumpen and the Bonapartist figure have a kind of symmetry at this precise point. He writes, the representative system created in modern times contains a hole that can never be filled, one that exists quite apart from the actual visible king, president, or emperor. Furthermore, it is precisely this hole that is repeated as the return of the repressed. So lumpenization is thus a structural feature that mirrors the rise of the Bonapartist figure, and both come about to resolve this crisis. So both the Bonapartist leader and the Lumpen enable the bourgeois order to continue, albeit in a pathetic and kind of hobbled way. The Bonapartist figure is not to be understood as a figure that comes from outside of the two ruling class parties and offers a separate solution. This was Engels's theory of the Bonapartist figure. Karatani rather maintains, and I agree with him, that the Bonapartist works within the two parties of the ruling class, and their function is to restabilize the bourgeois social order. This means that a Bonapartist figure can include figures that stretch between soft Bonapartism and hard Bonapartism. It's kind of interesting, we're thinking soft and hard, and then we're thinking honest and scoundrel, two kind of dichotomies, right? So who are soft Bonapartists? I think first is Louis Bonaparte III himself, but Karatani also suggests that figures like FDR, or, and he doesn't suggest this, but I think it's also valid, maybe even someone like Margaret Thatcher, could be thought of as soft Bonapartists. These are figures who seize a moment of crisis and forge a new consensus that simultaneously breaks all of the laws, of the kind of formal laws of what the ideological laws of what was deemed possible of the ruling parties. And they enable a kind of transgression of those in the name of sustaining the very order. So they therefore enact an otherwise impossible set of policy changes that enable the bourgeoisie to remain in power. And we know that Bonaparte III was a Bohemian poet. He considered himself a Saint Simonist socialist, as well as a kind of conservative at heart, right? I think this is very much the same with FDR, in fact. How is it possible to find a political figure who can embody in a non-representational way the kind of generalized crisis? That's a Bonapartist, right? Now, what's the other form of Bonapartism? What is hard Bonapartism? So I want to call your attention to Gramsci's definition of hard Bonapartism, what he calls Caesarism, okay? And actually Domenico Losurdo makes the distinction between soft and hard. For the record, it's Losurdo who makes that distinction. But Gramsci says, I'm going to give a quote from Gramsci. He says, quote, "For a social form always has marginal possibilities for further development and organizational improvement, and in particular can count on the relative weakness of the rival progressive force as a result of its specific character and way of life. It is necessary for the dominant social form to preserve this weakness. This is why it has been asserted that modern Caesarism is more a police than a military system." So therefore, for Gramsci, what makes Bonapartism soft instead of hard or fascistic is determined by the preservation of the weakness of the social form of the bourgeois ruling order itself. In other words, the softness of the Bonapartist figure is due to the softness of the progressive bloc within the ruling order and the absence of socialism within that ruling bloc. The softer the liberal order, the more the Bonapartists will remain within representative structures and restore it, albeit temporarily, of course. The Bonapartist thus wields a normative transformation amidst the crisis of representation, which is also, of course, a crisis over the very legitimacy and efficacy of the ideology and values of the bourgeois order itself. So I think Karatani's analysis helps us to see that a progressive liberal bloc within the ruling order tempers the softness or hardness of the Bonapartist, whereas the hard Bonapartist, on the other hand, handles the crisis of representation in such a way that they aim to push the leader to the limit, insisting, as Martin Heidegger did with Hitler, that he actually be a master, that he be an emperor before whom we bow. We can thus extrapolate the more general point from Karatani that the presence of a strong socialist party within the representational electoral apparatus, when facing a crisis, will likely witness hard Bonapartism emerge. Now, that's actually something we should debate, but I think this is a reading you could construe from Karatani's thesis. When socialism is weak, we get weak or soft Bonapartism because the compromise quotient within the representative apparatus is more tolerant to weakened demands. Okay. Now, this is my final section. It's a speculative section. I'm just gonna be very quick on this. It's called the Lumpenization of Humanity and the Monstrous Double. And here we go. So with this analysis, we can see that Bonapartism is a restoration process, which clumsily ushers in a new hegemonic bloc of the bourgeois social order. Lumpenization is both structural, part of capitalist life, but it's also this kind of tendency of an intra-class fragmentation that affects a multiplicity of classes. In moments of crisis, it is likely that this parasitic lumpenizing process becomes accelerated. It does not exactly matter which class it begins with, although Rancier's argument about it beginning with the bourgeoisie in 1848 is compelling. If 1848 kicks up a kind of ubiquitous lumpenization, and this is tied to the rise of a Bonapartist figure, we can witness a historical and logical linkage between these two processes, right? This is what I tried to claim above. This allows us to add to Barrow's analysis of the reactionary Lumpen coalition of the petty bourgeois clown show with the Lumpen militias and white nationalists that made Trumpism possible, the theory that Lumpenization is a doubling of social identity that erodes class solidarities and turns each class into its own sack of potatoes. This active verb-like form of lumpenization is a very useful political indicator of our present moment. Now, Eldridge Cleaver of the Black Panthers predicted a kind of prophetic point where he says, we're going to witness a lumpenization of humanity in late capitalism by virtue of automation and financialization. And he also predicted Trumpism, as we discussed last time. So while Cleaver's prediction of lumpenization relies on the theory of automation, discarding, I think all of that is a question of debate that we can have. There's actually a lot of new work. I'm thinking Aaron Benenev and Jason Smith are on this question. However, I want to draw your attention to a kind of literary motif of the doppelganger in this context. Now, the doppelganger emerges in the Enlightenment era with Goethe's Faust and with Hoffman's The Sandman. It's a literary motif that had to do with the way in which technological power contains a kind of prosthetic double, right? So the myth of the double had to do usually with the notion of a robot double who kind of mirrors humanity, and that humanity must aggressively fend off to preserve the kind of authentic core of itself. But today it seems to me that one area of research that might be useful to look at lumpenization and doubling is popular culture, where we find a lot of motifs of doubling. I want to draw your attention to two Hollywood films that deal with the double and dissociative fantasies of racial and class identity. The first one is Us by Jordan Peele that came out in 2019. The other one is Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley, as well as Antebellum by Gerard Bush and Christopher Renz. Now, I'm going to analyze Us, but I think these other films we can talk about if you'd like. But in Us, Peele reveals a lumpen bourgeois doubling, where he portrays a kind of black lumpen invisible underclass that is mysteriously connected to surrogate middle-class doubles in the above real world. Therefore, the film stages a kind of anxiety of lumpenization and the attendant shame that comes with middle-class bourgeois life. This is an anxiety tied to the fact that one can slip back into a lumpen status. And I think this is kind of resonant for Black people in America, given their class dynamics. This is an anxiety that's very real. And I think another effect of this is the notion that within bourgeois liberal institutions, people always say that they have what's called imposter syndrome, right? Which itself is a kind of dissociative doubling, right? So I wish to suggest that if Rancière is right and that lumpenization is a kind of generalized process, what we're effectively left with is a kind of schizophrenic doubling, right? However, I think also it's very important for us to understand that this lumpenization, or even the notion of the underclass, is very much a repressed metaphor. And I think that if you also look, just as an aside, Sorry to Bother You, the telework corporate elite experiment at the end of the film by Boots Riley actually has to do with the doubling of the proletariat into literal horses. Okay, so it's like a total loss of humanity, and it's a radical doubling in that sense. I'm not going to get into this notion. I have a whole thing on Freud and the Unheimlich and the way in which even Girard helps us talk about the notion of a monstrous double, and even the very status of the opioid lumpen deaths, right, which have now been eclipsed by COVID-19, also kind of function as a double which we can't face, and Girard gives that the name of the monstrous double, okay? I would furthermore suggest that a lot of liberal, kind of middle-class-ish ideological posturing to Trumpism still also relies now on a kind of politics in which one gains a kind of enjoyment from denouncing one's own education and stability qua the market in comparison to the kind of racist Trumpist scum, right? And so you see this kind of similar doubling within kind of white liberal critiques of Trumpism, which kind of in some sense mirrors in structural form what we saw in the film Us. So my wager is that contemporary political discourse has weaponized lumpenization of classes as a means to fortify a bourgeois-dominated political culture, one in which is by now resembling this kind of total bourgeois order that we saw after 1848. So now I'm reaching my conclusion. I just have a few points to make. These are all questions that I'll just pose. Number one, how do we confront the moral situation of lumpenization, which emerges as a response to bourgeois decadence? One obvious tendency is to moralize the proletariat itself as that class which is non-contradictory, or perhaps as that class which is impervious to lumpenization. But isn't such a conception of the proletariat run the risk of thinking about class as a kind of purity politics? So that's one thing I've seen on the left lately. Two, the lumpen as a surplus population of retirees and other state-supported semi-laboring classes, as well as gig workers and so on, the honest lumpen, is this class capable of being converted towards labor-centered political goals? Or is their very needy and desperate status they've been reduced to make them kind of subtle enemies of socialist and working class goals? Number three, can we say that Joe Biden is a Bonapartist figure in the sense that he's unifying and restoring, at least at a symbolic level, the ruling bourgeois order? Or will we see with Biden a kind of series of policy limitations that really do not exceed the kind of status quo of what's possible within neoliberal governance? Perhaps it's too early to tell. Number four, hard Bonapartism does not describe just any dictator. For example, Putin is not a Bonapartist. Rather, a Bonapartist figure emerges within the hegemonic bloc of the liberal capital nation state order in response to its unique crisis and aims to maintain and restore its norms. What does it mean, therefore, that the restoration of liberal norms is brought about by their total farcification? What does this say about liberal political norms as such? Number five, with these insights in mind, does it not make more sense to think of Hegel's first as tragedy, then as farce, as precisely reversed? First as farce, soft Bonapartism, then as tragedy, hard Bonapartism, fascism. Furthermore, it seems that socialism must have a strong footing within the representational sphere of capital nation state in order for hard Bonapartism to come about. This therefore would affirm Walter Benjamin's thesis that fascism comes about in the wake of a failed communist or socialist revolution, or as in the case of the Nazis and Mussolini, fascism actually comes about in the wake of a successful socialist revolution. Six, what precisely does the proletariat perform on this Karatanian notion of the whole in representation? Now, we know that lumpenization occupies the space of non-relation, and this non-relation also offers its unique power to plug that hole, right? Just like the Bonapartist. So therefore, how might we think of the proletariat from a position of non-relation? You see, because the lumpen have a kind of unique power, and I think this connects with one of Donald's questions as well. So should the proletariat sort of itself be thought of as a kind of non-lumpenized group, but also as a non-relation group, perhaps? So I'll end it at that. My apologies for going on for so long, everybody. Okay. I don't know who was first. Was it Crisanto, please?
Yeah. No, I think this idea of the lumpenization as a process of doubling is very, I liked it very much. I don't know if I got it right, so see if it's correct. But from what I could understand of your text, there are kind of three types of doubling. Maybe that's my question, because at one point you started talking about the idea that there is a lumpenization of finance aristocracy that doubles itself into a kind of lumpenization of the proletariat. So it's a kind of doubling of two different classes. Then the idea that bourgeoisie act as a class sometimes, but then it generates its double in the sense that some members of the bourgeoisie actually runs counter to the class interests. So that's within class doubling. And third, like there are this idea that a class of non-represented people, like the Society of 10th December, doubles in the sense that an individual comes to represent these unrepresentable interests. So it's kind of a doubling in between collective and individual kind of things. If I got this right, if this is right, then maybe, I don't know if it works, we could think of it as 3 types of Entfremdung, alienation maybe. The idea that we are generating an other that are actually part of the same phenomenon. You know, I'm not being dogmatic here with the concept of alienation. I'm taking it as in a broad sense. So my question is, does it work? Does it make sense? Is it related to what you say? And if it is, the idea that you quoted from Rancière that if everything, again, did I get it right? If everything is bourgeois, then proletariat is also bourgeois in ideological sense. And then in order for the proletariat to come to be, it needs to resist lumpenization. Then it comes to a kind of also an idea of alienation here. But what makes it interesting is the fact that, sorry for the cliche, but you know those pictures in which you see 2 faces facing each other, or a vase, like, so lumpen can be a class or a function. It depends on the way you look at it. It's not that dismissing the class and taking up the function statement. It's kind of depends on the way you look at it. Yeah, so does that make sense? Do you think, what do you think of it?
First of all, thank you for reading the text and for these comments, beautiful comments. Okay. I think Rancière's argument is very strange. It's a very strange text, The Philosopher and His Poor, because what he's doing there is not just an analysis of Marx, but an analysis of the status of a kind of more sunk. He doesn't call it lumpen, right? Lumpen for him still emerges in the conflagration of kind of 19th century labor struggles in a very like early formation of capitalism. But as you know, the part of no part, right? This more philosophical kind of category, he will discuss this as a feature of, in some sense, any social order. So there's an immediate ambiguity here. In that sense, I'm also thinking that one thing I need to do with this paper is invoke Hegel's concept of the rabble, right? Which was also, like Rancière's part of no part, trans-historical, if we could use that term. Now, could we derive a theory of generalized alienation from either of these kind of general categories of rabble or part of no part? I'm less convinced of that. I think the usefulness of looking at Marx's class struggle from the long 19th century, right, as a kind of continuity, as opposed to the kind of Althusserian notion of more strict breaks, is actually something I'm more inclined to do, right? So I'm kind of working with Rancière in a partial form. I don't know that he has a clear analysis, for example, of the cause and the effect of lumpenization. Is the economic emergence of the lumpen what causes the bourgeoisie to lumpenize itself? No, this would not actually make sense. Is it the normative substratum of the crisis of representation that the bourgeoisie then lumpenizes? That also would be too idealist, right? So there's a fundamental ambiguity about the cause and effect here of what brings about lumpenization. But putting those questions aside, I still think lumpenization is a kind of procedure which is very present, irrespective of how we diagnose its causality. Okay. Now, from that, let us talk about alienation. Okay. In some sense, I like very much the moralizing categories of honest versus scoundrel. it's interesting, of course, you see the optimism of Marx in making that claim, because what distinguishes the honest from the scoundrel is their relation to production. So then what, therefore, can we derive? And I think Donald mentioned this too. Does a full-time salaried employee fundamentally become honest? I mean, it's absolutely not the case. I think Rancière also makes the argument that what prevented a lot of late 19th century communism from happening was a split between artisan communists who absolutely were, had fidelity, versus militant communists. And the difference there was that there was a unwillingness on behalf of the artisans to exit a certain mode of life that they were comfortable with. In other words, they were not ready to construe communism vis-a-vis a quote unquote total break, i.e. they were unconvinced of the revolutionary path, right? And the reasons for that are kind of sociological and they are complex and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, like this is kind of a recurring dynamic of a struggle of communist organizing that I've seen. And we can cite many historical examples of that. Now, as it pertains to alienation, I think actually lumpenization refers only to intra-class. It's not cross-class. It is just unique that Bonapartism, whether it's soft or hard, emerges from two nodes that both have a non-relation. So that is a consistent line. The finance aristocracy and Lumpens below both share that non-relation as the kind of linkage there. So in that sense, that holds. But lumpenization still, I think, simply refers to the way in which decomposition, and even here, we also need to think of a kind of collective theory of death drive, because what Rancière says is a kind of anti-Spinozist line, which is, you know, the notion of Spinoza's conatus, right? Which is this notion of a kind of general conservation. Lumpenization is an active agent against this, right? So therefore, it's an active anti-socializing movement effort. So it's very interesting to me that contemporary capitalism is so effective at a kind of generalized lumpenization in some sense. So I think a lot more needs to be thought about this as well, because I was speaking also to Gabriel Tumpanamba, our friend, and he was really making a beautiful point, which was, look, alienation today actually doesn't function vis-a-vis the same alterity of otherness, of like, we become alienated when the monstrous immigrant other gets into our life world and disturbs. That had a certain resonance, maybe at certain times, and I think for some people, maybe it still does. But actually, Gabriel drew my attention to the fact that on the theme of the double, most doppelganger themes today and double themes today actually are ignited when you're facing the same, right? So it's actually problems of greater homogenization through globalization and so on that actually creates the scene of the Unheimlich, of the foreign, you know, extimate crisis. So that's actually something that is kind of a reversal of the sort of general alterity of doubling that I need to like think a lot more about, basically. And we have a debate about the film Us. Anyways, that's a whole other thing. So I don't know. I hope that answered your question. I think I did my best on that one.
No, yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Let's go to Donald.
So I thought it was interesting how you said that the Lumpenproletariat starts in the bourgeoisie. And I was kind of thinking about that because in the bourgeoisie,
Lumpenization.
Yeah, lumpenization, sorry. Lumpenization, it starts in the bourgeoisie. In a lot of ways, like, because the bourgeoisie as a class is already divided. It's divided by nature because different capitalists have to compete with each other. And, you know, so basically the form as a class collectivity, you know, the bourgeoisie has a lot of trouble doing this, and it relies on kind of the state in order to like come to a common class agenda to ensure the total reproduction of capitalism. But regardless, like capitalists are, they're primarily like, self-seeking, profit maximizing, firms. They're not acting as a collective class. And so you can almost kind of say that maybe the lumpenization of the proletariat is basically a process that mirrors this situation in the bourgeois class, where lumpenization essentially means that proletarians are no longer acting as a collective class with a common class collectivity, but are essentially acting as individuals competing with other proletarians for survival, which is honestly, kind of what makes it possible to buy off the lumpen, because they don't see themselves as part of a greater class collectivity, but as individuals who are hustling in the labor market to survive. And so, and it also mirrors the labor aristocracy, because as Marx and Engels say, the labor aristocracy is like kind of like an embouchement of the proletariat, where they no longer see themselves as workers in solidarity with other workers, but as kind of like a guild in the labor market that needs to manipulate the labor market to get as much of a salary or whatever as possible. And so I think in a way, the lumpenization of the proletariat could also kind of be seen as an embouchment of the proletariat, in the sense that the workers are acting less as a collective subject and more in line with the bourgeoisie. And you kind of see this with the strange relationship that the capitalist class has with kind of like the criminal underworld, because there's a lot of actual connections between the capitalist class and the criminal underworld, yet the capitalists like have to keep a kind of distance from it, and in order to maintain like a respectability. It's kind of like an other they can define themselves in relation to. But regardless, capitalism still has to like reproduce itself through organized crime. So I think maybe there's something there. That's just kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's really nice. Honestly, we need like I want to go back and look at some Marxist historiography to really make a diagnosis on Rancière's argument on 1848. I think he's right about this whole point about Flaubert and Balzac and like kind of late 19th century realism as presenting this kind of even like today, this word would resonate with us, a kind of fake world. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and I really like that point, which is, and even Rancière makes this beautiful point, which is, Marx didn't finish Capital in his life because he was afraid of it entering into this fake public sphere and kind of being reified. And so I think even the Lukácsian notion of reification, whatever we think of that category, is still very much tied to a general process of lumpenization itself, of the bourgeois lumpenization, right? So I'm really convinced of lumpenization as a verb, and I think it's a very useful kind of, let's call it a heuristic, as a kind of device of analysis. And so, and I totally agree with you that the split of the bourgeoisie is structured in the way that you have it, and I think that it's very striking to me today. Just some of the discourse on the left reveals the success of the bourgeoisie rendering the whole world as just a sack of potatoes. But with that being said, is not the same atomization that Marx was looking at. And it's not the same atomization because of a number of reasons, right? Like we're in a kind of completely different config, which is why my earlier section, I think, on the honest lumpen invites us to rethink alienation precisely in the absence of labor, or in the absence of a completely new structure of unemployment, a completely new structure of state dependency, right? A structure of state dependency in which the very status of the people like have a negative relation to it, right? So there's a whole big question there that I'd love to discuss with you all around kind of representational struggles and the kind of large scale challenges there around the, so that's like a whole thing that, and that's why I liked Barrow's chapter on post-Marxism. I found it very challenging in a certain sense. But anyways, okay, Matthew.
Yeah, your mention of Gramsci's idea of Caesarism reminded me of the final paragraph of Marx's preface to the 18th Brumaire, just because I've read it recently and the words stuck out to me. He actually rejects the word Caesarism for the events he's describing. Says, I hope my work will contribute toward eliminating the current German scholastic phrase, which refers to a so-called Caesarism. This superficial historical analogy ignores the main point, namely that the ancient Roman class struggle was only fought out within a privileged minority, between the free rich and the free poor, while the great productive mass of the population, the slaves, formed a purely passive pedestal for the combatants. And I don't think the rest is as essential as that point. And that sort of reminded me that of Professor Barrow's comparison between the Lumpen proletariat and the Roman proletariat. And I was wondering if you see any significance in that, or what you might say about that. And then the second thing was about the sort of distinction between hard and soft Bonapartism being about the presence of socialism as a sort of political possibility, or as a presence. And that made me think of the role of socialism in the 18th Brumaire, which is that the royalist bourgeoisie, sort of gives themselves up by strengthening the state in fighting off socialism and the proletariat, and then that state, the army, etc., is used to suppress them. And so socialism does play a political role in the 18th Brumaire, but I suppose the difference would be that socialism was a stronger, like, organized phenomenon in interwar Italy and Germany, and there had been a socialist revolution. So maybe it's more of maybe that's not such a strict division, and there's more of a gradation, or maybe the fact of revolution or the possibility of a socialist revolution is the sort of dividing line. So those were just sort of some things I was curious about.
Great points. Yeah, I think the Karatanian argument, or well, first with Gramsci, his playing off of the way in which these kind of looser social forms are manipulable by the Bonapartist figure is nice, because I think he's one of the first Marxists who really will show that the rise of 20th century fascists was an explicit kind of continuation of a certain degraded social form that started with Bonapartism. And so the distinction there is, instead of abiding by the representational logics and making a mockery of them and so on, like Trump or Bonaparte does, they're explicitly discarded, right? They're explicitly discarded in the name of a kind of literally plugging the hole, right? Literally resolving the crisis of the democratic parliamentary system by inserting the Führer. And so that's one way to look at a definition of the distinction between hard and soft. Yet, I wonder if the historical record bears out that thesis of hard Bonapartism, in the sense that even if we look at far right-wing political figures today, from Orban to Bolsonaro to Trump and so on, I wonder actually if, to what extent they would be much more militantly fascist if we had a kind of not socialist presence, but actually a presence of communism. Because I actually think maybe the issue, I need to put more thought to this, but I think maybe the issue is actually not so much a presence of socialism within representational strata and so on, but it's actually the presence of a communist presence as such, that may be more elemental to what would lead a Bonapartist figure to emerge to drastically resolve the crisis of representation in the way that they do. Precisely because the proposal of the communist is also, in its own way, addressing the crisis of representation outside of the representation system itself, you see. So maybe it's actually not socialism, but it is the presence of communism. And I think that actually there's a lot of Marxist philosophers and others that have suggested something similar to that. So that would be my one response to that. Do you agree with that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess I would have to see, I mean, Marx in the 18th Brumaire, I mean, the leaders, I guess, of the socialist proletariat, I guess since Blanqui and the other communists have been arrested, I guess since you had the Montagne, the sort of the Red Mountain, the sort of Montagne who had dressed themselves in socialistic phrases, I guess you could sort of make that the presence of socialism, and then say maybe if Blanqui was free, you might have had a harder Bonapartism, or if there had been a real, like, you know, if the proletariat was bigger and had been communist, then maybe there's that possibility.
Yeah, it's definitely worth thinking. I'm not committed to this line, but I am committed to the status of the Bonapartist structure, and I am committed to this kind of looser. Like, I very much like the idea that even FDR is a Bonapartist, right? I like that proposal. When it comes to distinguishing between hard and soft Bonapartism, I'm not sure, because I still think Bolsonaro and Trump still are fascistic, right? So you know what I'm saying? Like, it kind of constrains us to rely on it so strictly. Okay, all right. So Kate, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. First, I want to say I really appreciated the speculative end of it. If there's any more of that, I'd love to hear it whenever. The stuff on Us in particular, because I think that's an underanalyzed film. And then one quick thing is, I was wondering maybe if Nixon would also fall into that line of Bonapartism. And I don't know if this is in the theories of the theorists mentioned, but because it seems like, at least recently especially, there's a certain aspect of a Bonaparte figure where they play almost like a vanishing mediator for the liberal order, like in a Hegelian way. So like, you know, Nixon, like that like the upturning everything so it can continue, like Nixon with the Nixon shock, taking us off the gold standard. Certain other domestic reforms too, I think wouldn't have been possible for even like the only Nixon could have gone to China sort of aspect, which then became part of the Doha kind of following him. I get the sense even with
even Johnson with civil rights.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I was almost even thinking you could fuse the two, like Johnson and Nixon, into like a singular figure almost. But then with Trump, I almost get the sense that he becomes a necessary figure for liberalism as we reach both this further lumpenization, but also the increase of crises on all fronts, like with the pandemic now and climate disaster, where the sense I'm kind of getting is even just the personality of Trump, this sort of like the complete removal of the human face of the liberal order. I feel like you see that picked up a little bit from Biden, even in the election, but especially something like Andrew Cuomo, like the sort of like, you know, they died, they're dead, that sort of thing. I don't think that would have been possible before Trump, and it also seems necessary for the liberal order now. But then the main question I kind of had was still about just the previous question too. It seems very interesting with the hard and soft Bonapartism. I was kind of connecting a little bit to, I wonder if you'd see this as valid, the Lasorda reading on populism for the Sama Tomsic group. Specifically, I think he was talking about like 3 aspects of what happens with a left populism. And I asked a similar question last time too, but it was, I think the third aspect was something how like a left populism ends up like muddying the primary contradiction of class contradiction. And that's something that the right populist can kind of take advantage of a little bit by either forming like a false front, or it seemed to me like that would be a certain avenue where you could have this Caesarism argument or hard Bonapartism argument. Because similarly with that, how I got the sense with both in 2016 and 2020, that there were certain people on the populist right, some of the ones more with their like nose actually to the ground, figuring out what was going on, that were excited by a Bernie proposition. By the proposition of having Bernie out there, it seemed like there's a sense that's like, if somebody like him is on the forefront, we can really start to like wet our teeth, and we can kind of like get a little edgier with our approach. That was just the sense I was getting kind of from all fronts. Even Trump's disappointment with the Biden nomination. There's a town hall he actually gave here in Scranton where he talks about how prepared he was for Bernie to be the nominee. Like, oh, we're going to hit him all the commie stuff, all the socialism stuff. There seemed to be even just a libidinal disappointment in that moment that I don't know. It seems like a mix between that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and the Lizardo line.
No,
But yeah.
that's great. It kind of reminds me to Matthew's point about why I said socialism, is because my view is really that, like, if Sanders would have won, I think that, first of all, like, I think things would have got a lot more violent than they did. And I think we should be sober to that fact. Okay. So yeah, okay, there's one thing for this like grand European genealogy from 1848, but there's another very like super American focused question of like post 2016 rise of this kind of new socialist reality that Sanders ushered in, right? So there's two different discourses going on here. And I'm kind of trying to speak to both, right? Because Barrow's original presentation was really about like our present, right? So I feel like in our present, I wonder if you agree. I think that the reactionary petty bourgeois base, okay, we can call it lumpenization and so on, whatever, but that kind of hard hat libertarian Jeffersonian orientation is like reactionary to the bone, right? And I feel that after the propaganda of the decades of Cold War anti-communist stuff, I think if Sanders would have won, those 60,000 militias, 60,000 militia members, what would they have done? Just hypothetically, I mean, this is a very simple question, but like, don't you think that things would have gotten a lot more out of hand? Like Kate is libidinally, like they're. Do you agree with that, Matthew? Like, or do others? Am I dreaming this or?
Oh yeah, I totally think that if Sanders had won, we'd have seen more violence, and I think.
Me too. Yeah.
I think. I actually do think a lot of the ruling class saw him as a threat, and I do think that they would have honestly like gone to Trump even instead of Sanders.
Oh, yeah.
I could see even like liberals like uniting with MAGA people against Sanders.
That would have happened. Like Bloomberg wing, right? They would have done that.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyways, so yeah, Cade, I love the thesis of vanishing mediator, but part of the coherence of the soft and hard Bonaparte thing becomes a little incoherent when we start saying that any deviation of a kind of liberal leader, president, whatever, constitutes Bonapartism. You know what I'm saying? Like we then kind of lose the thread of consistency of its causality. And I also think we really need to stress the ambiguity of the whole causality between the Lumpen and the Bonapartist. It's not exactly that clear how the two unite and how the two forces function in tandem, although we know that they do. A, and then B, we also know that Lumpenization is like an extremely useful way to talk about intra-class fragmentation. And then on your point of, as it pertains to the kind of norms of Cuomo that we saw today on the news, which is totally revealed that he's a total SOB and so on, and like all of that, we can kind of, the liberal order can kind of absorb these contradictions, and therefore Trumpism functioned as a kind of structural means by which to deteriorate the kind of propensity for an already deteriorated set of norms to even have granted further normalcy to them. So I think there's a whole thing to study about this business. There's a whole business that Hegel wrote in his Anthropology around why the Roman Empire was not a state composed of spirit, was because Hegel had the notion in Hegel's theory of decadence. It's like this new text that I'm reading about Hegel and decadence, which is really opening my eyes a lot to kind of Hegel's debate with Marx, but also, or Marx's debate with Hegel, on this notion of the decadence of norms. And a lot of analytic Hegelians are huge on norms and stuff, but like, I feel like they also are playing the same dangerous trap, which is they're willing to remain within the crisis of representation of the bourgeois order, kind of thinking that one can kind of plug the hole here and there and kind of sustain the ship, as opposed to a total revolution or a total transformation and so on. So anyways, I know we have time and I want to turn to Crisanto unless there's any final points. Okay, my friend, floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to, well, I'm actually doing my thesis on something which is completely different from this discussion. I'm studying Goethe's Faust for my PhD thesis, but I happen to have had militant participation in an urban movement here in my local city. And it was a very unique experience of politicizing the Lumpenproletariat. And so I think it's kind of interesting that we could talk a little bit about it. So the idea was, I was a militant in a party, left-wing party, the same that Gabriel Tupinambá was too. And that's where we met, actually. But then, you know, we had this fetish, like every left-winger has, that we could organize a factory strike, you know. Workers could take up factories and maybe control production and stuff like this. I mean, it's left-wing fetishism, pure and simple. But we never could meet someone that could make the bridge, how can I put it, that could, we could never get in the factories. And why, of course, I don't mean having the address and getting there, but, you know, meeting people and trying to organize stuff inside factories. So we had to turn somewhere else in order to be really militants and so on. So things started when we tried to realize what we should do. So if we cannot get into the factory, where should we go to? And what I'm going to say now is kind of a logical explanation and a formula that we and my comrades, we got together to think about it. But at the time, it was not perceived so, you know, so it's like the owl of Minerva. It's only after this happened that we could have this formula and so on. But the idea is like, you have only 3 places of militancy or sites of militancy. You can either have popular movements or trade unions or students' movements. In what sense are they places or sites? In a very first literal sense, they are places in the sense that, you know, in popular movements, you're militant in a neighborhood, in a trade union, in a factory or a place of work, if it's not a factory, in the students' movements, in universities or colleges or schools or whatever. So in this very literal sense, they are places of movement, of militancy. But also in a more kind of philosophical, although it's like a militant philosophy, like, there are places of militancy in the sense that, you know, you can be, if you're a black person, a black guy or woman, you're a militant in the black movement. But, you know, it's not like newer generations tend to confuse this, like, because I'm black, if I was black, because I'm black, I'm already a militant, which is not true. Like, you know, only because you suffer racism, and they do suffer, and you react to this, it doesn't mean you're a militant. You are a militant of the black movement, either in the popular movements, like, for example, great example, the Black Panthers, or in the trade unions, or in students' movements. And of course, you can have a kind of a mixture of the 3. So like here in Brazil, you have these landless movements that are kind of, you know, because peasants live in the same place they work. So it's kind of a mixture of the things. So, you know, we couldn't get in the factory. Where would we go? We went to the popular movement. Then suddenly we realized that the obvious thing, you know, we couldn't get in the factories, mostly because Brazil doesn't have that many factories. Our process of industrialization were aborted for a time. And there are a lot of social forces that runs counter to the country's development of its own industries. So I would like, can I share a screen here, Daniel? I think, can you guys see this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's kind of, you know, this movement we organized, which is called Popular Movement for Householding, MPM. It's the what it stands for in Portuguese. So here's a picture of one of our demonstrations. So this is the idea where some historical background begins, because we have this so-called 1930s revolution, in which this guy, former president Getúlio Vargas, actually changed the country, you know, from an exporter of rural commodities to a first industrialization process, which was very important for us, not only because of economic obvious reasons, but also this process in the 20th century was actually really important for other countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Like, for example, until then, you had this very strong prejudice that tropical countries could not industrialize themselves, either because it was too hot, or because people were too lazy, or because they were Mamelukes, you know, mixture of Europeans with Negroes or whatever. And so they could not industrialize itself. And Brazil actually proved that this all was fake. You know, we probably knew that all the time, but like, you know, there was this current prejudice and so on. But after Getúlio did this, and Getúlio had a tragic ending, he killed himself, a lot of reactionary forces either tried to stop the movement of its industrialization or try to background it. So, for example, you can see former President Lula as a kind of continuation of Getúlio's policy, and you have Bolsonaro as a kind of reaction to it. So the idea, where I want to get to this, is that here, it's paradoxically enough, it's not like borders between proletariat and lumpen are thinner. No, it's actually that they are very, very distinct. So, like, for example, here in Brazil, if you're a proletariat in the strictest sense, you probably earn more than me, who am a professor and a teacher. You know, it's kind of, they're kind of like a middle class person. They're kind of an elite of worker class. And what you have as the gross majority of the mass population of the poor people are something under proletariat. And we could call it lumpen in that strict sense of the, how Marx said, the deepest, the lowest, oh my God, level of the poor people. So yeah, that's it. Why couldn't we go to the factories? Because there aren't many. It's not that easy. So if you want to be a militant in Brazil, you will probably have to face the fact that you have to be a militant not with the working class in the strictest sense, either with peasants or, in our case, with the urban populations of the suburbs, which are mostly lumpen proletariat. So, sorry, this is a kind of a map of where I am here. That's Brazil. That's the state I live in here, which is Paraná, called Paraná. And that's the city in Paraná that I live in. That's Curitiba. That's just to have a picture of it. So we started our militancy. We were still in the party in the kind of these precarious neighborhoods. I took the term from Engels' working class in England, you know, that's he calls it schlechte Vierteln. I think this makes Engels kind of a, you know, that's a common motto. Engels as a forefather of social anthropology or something like this. But he has this very good idea of economic social concepts materialized geographically in the space. That's a very, that's an idea that we take a lot of care. We pay a lot of attention to this, you know, our relation to the physical spatiality of capitalism and how these things become spatial. And you can see this from the picture. I don't know if you guys have these kinds of situation in the US, but you see this are really, really poor stuff, right? Really poor neighborhoods. They're like, my God. This is what a real slum, like in Mike Davis' book, which is actually a book that we admire a lot. So we were doing these movements. What's the problem that we faced when we got to these poor neighborhoods? It's another thing that we formulated collectively. We didn't read it anywhere, but it's the idea that you won't mobilize people. You won't mobilize people with the dramatic existence of life. What do I mean by that? You get to these places, you face a number of problems. Like, for example, the lack of school, don't have school enough for every kid. So that's a problem. We need to mobilize people in order to have school. But, this is part of life. It has always been like that. It will always be like that. So people won't mobilize themselves because of it. That's part of the dramatic existence of life. Life in capitalism is like this. There's no school for poor people. Always been like this, will always be like this. So what are the situations in which people mobilize themselves in the tragic event? So like a kid dies in school because of lack of care, someone let a kid die. Then the people mobilize themselves, they burn everything out, they make demonstrations and stuff like this. So it's very hard to mobilize them for these dramatic agendas. So what we started to know is that we needed this kind of tragic event. Don't worry, I'm not suggesting that we should kill anybody or anything like this, but we need like some sort of mini event to do it. And since we were reading the Mike Davis book and so on, we thought I was very impressed, and my comrades too, I was very impressed with the concept, Mike Davis' concept of pirate urbanization. I don't know if I'm getting the terms right because I read the book in Portuguese translation. So don't know if you'll get this, if you recognize this, but he calls at some point this pirate urbanization. You don't have householding policies, so people need to live somewhere. What do? They invade the places. So our idea was that these pirate urbanizers, they were not politicized. They were Lumpenproletariat. We were politicized. Sorry for the modesty, but we were politicized, but we didn't have the courage to invade somewhere. So we needed to learn from these people in order that we could make our own invasion and occupation, and then start a process of a mini event that could mobilize these guys and so on. So we went to this. We kind of met these pirate urbanizers. I won't show pictures of them nor tell their names because they live in the margin of legality, to say the least. So we met these guys. We hanged around with these guys with a very clear concept that we could not propose ourselves to lead because shit can happen very easily. It's a kind of a criminal, almost criminal kind of agency, although they are on the right side of history. They're my God, they want houses. That's so yeah, we went there and we learned whatever we want, whatever we needed. Then suddenly, my wife, which is actually my comrade, is here watching things. So so yeah, we went there, we hanged around with these guys, and then all of a sudden, one of these guys who became friends with me, he called me for an invasion that would happen, asked if I wanted to go. Me, when I say I, it's actually us, right? It's a collective state. But yeah, we went there. But as we got there, for a number of reasons, this guy didn't show up. I was there. We were there, me, my wife, my comrades, people were there, the actually homeless people. And the terrain, the land was there, empty. What should we do? Yeah, let's try to invade it and so on. Didn't work, police came, so we had the forced eviction and stuff, but we had the insight to take the contacts of everybody and try to organize a second entry into the terrain. But now we would get the contacts, we would visit people in their own houses or wherever they lived and try to call more people. From these meetings, we would have everyone contact again and try to go to their own houses and call more people and so on, so that we could guarantee invasion by mass mobilization, right? Let me explain something that might not be clear. When I say homeless here in Brazil, that doesn't mean people who live in the streets. That mean people who compromise about 60 to 7% of their income with rent, right? So it's like total shit life, because you can't buy things, you can't even buy your own house, and you depend on this rent stuff. Yeah. So what we did then was we went to this little terrain here, which was this land I was talking about. This is a poor neighborhood. We always would choose a neighborhood that is already installed so that massification could happen quickly. And we invaded this place. So we tried, let me jump to another situation. So we invaded this. After 2 years or so, pressure went up, occupation was growing a lot. We invaded this other terrain, which is contiguous to the first one. And then we just crossed the street. We would invade this terrain. It was a night, about midnight one day, but police showed up. So we simply we made this way and entered the other terrain here. And then after the next year, it's from yearly, almost yearly period. The next day we invaded this terrain, and so we made this huge complex of favelas here that were our base of mobilization. But then let me go. Who are these people who came up? Who are these lumpen proletariats? These guys are they're not properly spin-offs of capitalist revolution, because as I said, most of them never been proletariat in the strictest sense. They either came from a peasant condition, or they would live this kind of in-between regularity jobs, you have qualified job. In order to be an electricist, you actually have to know a lot of things. It's a very abstract concept, the idea of a current, So you kind of have to be a qualified worker. But when you're installing some electric system, sometimes you just need to take up the wires from here to there. So you can have, these are what we would call in Portuguese the assistant electricist. There are unqualified people who are working with the qualified workers, proper workers. And so they live this in between. Since their job are unqualified, anyone can do it. They can work with it, but then if there are no jobs, they would go into crime, drug dealing or whatever, or bribing or whatever. And so they live this in between things. They are periodically, Marx actually says in the 18th Brumaire, a very interesting concept. It's zweideutige Subsistenzmittel. I think we could translate it as a kind of ambiguous income. That's really ambiguous in the sense it's not illegal income simply. It's ambiguous. They're either one way or another. And this ambiguity also becomes has some social symbolics related to it. Like, for example, here in Brazil, we are a traditional Catholic country, but evangelical churches are growing a lot in the past 30 or 40 years. So these guys are, evangelical at morning and bandits at afternoon. You know what I mean? They're kind of, when situations get really bad, they go to the church, they ask for help, then situation got better, and then they go back to criminality and stuff like this. Another thing that this really shocked me when I realized it is the rate of mutilation about these guys, especially of the fingers, man. It's, my God. Then only after I could realize the importance, the symbolic importance of having a former president like Lula who didn't have a finger. This is like the reality of Brazilian workers. This guy right here, his name is Leonardo. In his right hand, he had only 2 fingers, and he lost all of it because of precarious conditions of work. It's, my God, I even get somehow emotional when I remember this, because it's total degradation. It's completely humiliation stuff. So yeah, this is one of our occupations here. This actually one day in which the police came. They were trying to do eviction, but they had only one car, and we were thousands of people, so they had to go back. This guy is, his name is Anderson, and he was living in the streets, really. homeless in the strictest sense. And this guy, Mr. Antonio, was a former peasant. He even militated in the peasants movement. So yeah, this is a picture of the favelas we created, like many pictures of the favelas we created. Basically what we did, you know, you see the numbers here that we wrote on the houses. The idea was that we would enumerate all the houses and try to make a kind of census of who lived there, how many people would live there, if there are old people, kids, and so on. And this became part of our strategy. Well, a strategy for what? Because in the very first day, actually in the very second day, my comrade Frank Maciel, I think he's here with us, he slept there in the first day, me too. The idea, like in 48 hours, we jumped from 30 families to 600 families. The process of massification was really huge. And I kind of felt like Victor Frankenstein when the monster woke up, you know, it's like, my God, what did I do? It's like, because it's like the Zizek talking about the next day in the revolution, you know, we make a mini revolution. Now, what should we do? And then this is where this guy comes about. This guy is Guilherme Boulos. He's the leader of the biggest homeless movement in Brazil. Their headquarters are in São Paulo, the biggest city of Latin America. If you haven't heard of this guy, pay attention, because you're probably going to hear, he just ran for the presidency of, for the city mayor of São Paulo, and he got second. He was very well voted. And he will probably run for the presidency of Brazil in 2022 if we had elections, because it's not certain. Well, this guy is very good friends of mine. And then I called him, like, what should we do? And then he explained me that there was this householding programming of former government of Workers' Party that consisted of the idea that you could organize a self-building structure, like people would build their own houses with the help of the government, with public money and so on. And this to me is a very revolutionary program in the reformist sense, paradoxically enough, because, you know, the idea is this would allow us to invade the places, then mobilize the people to have the houses built in this public program. My God, this was the greatest idea that Dilma Rousseff ever had. The problem is, even the parters, cadres didn't know of the existence of this program. So we lost a lot of time trying to explain this to the very party who created it. It's like total mess. And in our opinion, Dilma was impeached precisely because she didn't embrace her own idea to the end. This would be a very, there's another thing, like, it's a common social democratic, even among the left, consensus that parliamentarism is better than presidentialism. I doubt it very much, because presidentialism, again, paradoxically enough, creates the condition for a coalition between president and the mass, right? So if programs like this, like Daniel put in social democratic policy, are they a solution for the Lumpen proletariat? I would answer, sorry, I take the liberty, yes, on the condition that you have a counterpart, and that's political counterpart. Yeah, you give houses to the people, but you ask them to mobilize themselves. This is why we enumerated the houses, so that we can have, like, you want your house, you need to go to demonstrations. You know, you don't want to go to demonstrations, that's fine. So you wait for your house to fall from the heavens on a public policy. But if you want it with us, you have to go to demonstration. And you can see here from the picture how this worked. In São Paulo, they got to the point of mobilizing 50 million people. 5 million people. We could never do this. We could never do this. We mobilized 1,000 people, but for a city like Curitiba, it was very strong and important mobilization. So the idea was an idea, I think it's Thomas Schelling, you know, the logicist, who talks about the idea that you create a conflict in order to negotiate a peaceful solution. This is basically what we did. You see, this is a headquarters of the Paraná state government, and this is our people, you know. it's completely occupied. And this guy is the representative of the government who are forced to go there and give an answer. We gave him the microphone, you know, say what you will. And he, of course, would be, he would feel a little bit embarrassed to say that we would earn nothing. So by this way, we could always kind of catch people from their tongue in order that we could arrange some kind of compromise. Not always this did work. Like, for example, I remember one day that we invaded the city hall because the city major promised us something that he didn't deliver. So we simply rented 10 buses, crowded it up with people, and then appeared in the city hall all of a sudden, 8 o'clock in the morning or so. And we simply invaded it. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. We want to negotiate with the city major. And this, so by doing this, we would always try to get some compromise from the part of the government. And this was working very well. Like here we have this day we invaded the city hall. This is the vice major, you know, and this is us here, our guys and ladies. This is my wife. And this is the way, this is the day we actually stopped the highway here. We created 150 kilometers of traffic by this demonstration. And we actually did this. This was the most audacious movement we did, which is a protest in the city hall at the same time that we paralyzed the highways. So it's like, you know, we are negotiating here. If everything goes wrong, we leave the highway alone and cars can circulate. If it doesn't, we stay there and we stop circulation for as long as it takes. And this was very effective. But yes, of course, it needs some kind of ethical minimum on the part of the government in order to do this. With Bolsonaro, things got really bad. Actually, when Dilma was impeached, the whole program of the collective building of houses and so on, this completely vanished. So yeah, we kind of had to make a drawback, you know, for our own security and so on. And Bolsonaro, with the discourse of hatred, we could easily get killed in one of these demonstrations by some, how can I say, some resistant force of the Lumpenproletariat, which they exist. We faced this very time, like drug dealers, kind of bandits that were living in the occupations. They didn't like us at all. So we always had to kind of negotiate with them or staying there and so on. At the same time, they needed the movement because it was kind of a human face for them to, not a human face for them. It's kind of a human organization, political mobilization that helps them to hide themselves. You know, you can never have a favela of bandits. Bandits need to hide behind honest people, which I think is how honest proletariat, criminal proletariat comes at the concept of the very intra-class kind of estrangement, alienation thing. So yeah, we lost. But how surprised was I when I learned that after we made this drawback, the movement kind of had its own autonomy. So during the pandemics, this guy here, which is a total Lumpen proletariat, man, our friend, I love him. He's a very good friend of mine, but he has a background. I'm not going to expose him, but oof, it's really rough life and lifestyle. But this guy actually organized a new occupation, a new invasion, using our very same techniques, our very same symbolics, using the name of the movement. I almost feel like it's like my second son. I have a 3-year-old son and this new movement. And so, yeah, things had a continuation. Just to conclude, I had this, when we met those pirate urbanizers that I was talking about earlier, one thing that struck me a lot, and that's kind of a knowledge we had from Lumpen proletariat mobilization, is that political education political formation, don't know how you call that in English. Political education doesn't work really well with the Lumpenproletariat, because you try to explain them concepts of Marxism or in history and so on, and they tend to look at it as some kind of narcissistic feature of us. Like, so this guy I met, this pirate urbanizer, so the second or third day I met him, he started to talk to me about, very spontaneously, about Che Guevara and class struggle and how the political elite rules and so on. And I kind of has this epiphany. He is saying that because he knows that this is what I want to hear, not because he's really believing in this. So we never really got, you know, to organize a class or a talk or whatever on Marxism, because we knew this would be very inefficient for our purposes. So what we did instead was kind of incorporating, like, I'm an atheist, son of an atheist father with an atheist mother. My father was a former militant too. What we did was kind of studying the Bible a lot. You know, so I remember one day that we made this huge assembly, loads of people, and we were trying to decide if we would or not invade a contiguous terrain. And instead of saying, should we invade or not? Well, yes, you know, we should, because Marx says in the 21st chapter of the Capital that the conditions of the working class living in their neighborhoods are this and that. No, my answer was, yes, we will invade. And you know why? Because in Deuteronomius chapter 11, God says to Moses that it's their right to invade the sacred land. And if God says that we should invade, no policeman will say we shouldn't. And this was like, wow, fire. People was like, yeah, this is like, you know, they didn't get this like, this is what he's trying to say. No, they got this like, well, that's very logical, you know? Yeah, God said we should invade, so why should a policeman say we shouldn't? So this is the kind of experience we had. Sorry to be so testimonial. I think I didn't want, I talked this to Daniel to make a deep conceptual analysis of things, but I really wanted to share this with you. It's one of my, maybe the coolest thing I've ever done in my life. It's a pity that I cannot include this in my curriculum because it would be a little bit embarrassing. But yeah, this is what I did.
Oh man. That was brilliant. I loved it. Great. That was a great case study, man. Who's written about this? Like, do you have a text?
Yeah, Frank, is Frank here with us? We made some formulas of this. Frank wrote a very good text about this, which is where he kind of theorizes the 5 levels of militancy, which is, I think, brilliant thesis of him. That is the idea that he's saying he's wrote in Portuguese, yeah. But the idea that, you know, you have 5 levels, hierarchies of militancy. We use that a lot in our conceptualization. Like you have mass, base, militants, cadres, and leaderships. This kind of work in the sense that, you know, mass is how many people you can mobilize in how long. Like, for example, if we were to do a demonstration, each one of us, how many people could we gather together in a month, for example? This is mass, you know. These people are not consistently included in the movement and so on. Militants are people that, base are people that we can count to, you know, whatever it is. You can give them tasks and they will fulfill the tasks. Militants are people who are more organized in the movement. They incorporate symbolics and things like that. Cadres are the one who make a kind of a transition between leadership and militants, but also transition between pragmatics and theory. And the leadership are the people who respond to the movement. All this was formulated by Frank, a very good text, very nice. And Guilherme Boulos wrote a book too, which will I find? I actually made the cover for this book, which is Why We Occupy is the name of the book, but in Portuguese, Por que Nós Ocupamos. This book is very interesting telling experiences. We learn a lot from Guilherme Boulos, telling experiences of this formulation. And we have newspapers, videos. You can look for it on YouTube. I actually showed some of this to Daniel. Yeah, but we never wrote a book or anything so systematized about it. It were really short texts and occasional.
Yeah. Very nice, man. Congratulations. It sounds like I understand what you mean when you say that the event was a real personal revelation for you. I can see why that would be the case. It's very interesting what you say about education. I think Mike Davis said something interesting once in an interview I listened to him. He said, one of the things that halted the possibility of American socialism was the birth of evangelical Christianity in Los Angeles. And he gave it a date of like the 1920s or something like this. So I actually do a lot of work in that field myself. And it's really tough, man. I mean, in the United States too. But it's very interesting that you have this kind of permeable or kind of ideological flexibility. Like in the United States, you have all of this kind of like exaggerated ideological signifiers with socialism that can be very difficult to move in those spaces of the mega church evangelical and so on. But the fact that this kind of generalized lack of ideological coherency that the favelas and the slum dwellers maintain enables you to kind of have an ease of communication with them, and also to prevent any kind of Maoist ideological training. You're saying this is not necessary, right? Like,
yeah,
it's more effective to just simply work on their level and kind of do these theatrics, right? To do this kind of
like the first thing they would always ask is like, like for example, we would gather an assembly. I would talk, or my wife would talk, or guys, and we would say, you know, tomorrow demonstration in the front of the city halls. One of the first things when people met us for the first time is like, will you be there with us? And we would go, yeah, of course, we will be there with you. Then secondly, they start to learn that what we were doing, and of course we could talk with the city major. They can't, because they're very laconic. And this is the idea that they speak in anacolute is not accidental. This is part of their survival, I think, but that's another subject. But we can, you know, you get a guy like this, he goes to in front of the city major, he said he wants householding. The major talks a lot of bullshit about legislation, and that all can be resumed to a no, like, no, you won't have it. But we could kind of deal with it, you know. Yeah, I know laws. I know what you're saying. This is not true. We could try it. And they would watch this and say, wait a minute. These guys who dress in red, who are all bearded guys, I'm not anymore, but I was. These guys actually know how to do stuff. It works. You know, we're going there, we do the demonstration. They say that if demonstration is big, city major will concede, and they do, and he does. So, you know, this is political education in pragmatics. It's nothing to do with talking about concepts, but there's a problem. I didn't tell you the story of how I went out of the party, because precisely because of this flexible ideology to work with the Lumpen Proletariat, this creates all sorts of problems with other socialists, especially among the LGBT movements. This is not a critic by any means of the LGBT, but they could understand it, this kind of Christianity stuff, as if I was a male chauvinist, you know, or endorsing some sort of prejudice and things like this, which is completely far from it. Even our debates with these guys are for tolerance and whatever you call it, like, but with a Christian accent, let's put it that way, because that's the language they really, if they read anything, because illiteracy is high rated, if they read anything, they read the Bible. My God, what's the secret about it, you know? And especially you have a different relation to it, because since you're a Protestant nation, one of the one of the key difference between Protestantism and Catholicism is that in Protestant, they teach people to read because they need to read Bible, even if they are slaves, right? This makes total difference. Here in Brazil, it's because of Catholicism, but well, it's another story. But yeah, we had strong difficulties with these ideology debates among the left. Yeah.
Interesting. Any other
Yeah,
questions? Go ahead, Donald.
I was going to say I have a little bit of experience, I guess, organizing the Lumpenproletariat. I was doing some tenant organizing in Section 8 housing, and it was all around, this one particular tenant. He was a retired janitor who had experience of being in a union, so he did have some experience of collective struggle, but he got pistol whipped one night and it permanently disabled him, and so he couldn't work anymore, so he was retired. And he was, Section 8 housing, the landlord there was basically just very arbitrary, very racist, very controlling. And so we started, just kind of sneaking around, because whenever we would go to the neighborhood to talk to people, like the landlord would, she would chase us out basically. But we did get a few people who would go out on a picket for us. And I kind of see what you're saying about how you got to kind of put on a show, because we were picketing the apartment complex, and a lot of random people recognized how terrible this slumlord was, and how they had experience, oh, my cousin, they dealt with this woman, she sucks. And so we kind of put on a show in front of the apartment complex, and more people started coming in. And I think that was, you definitely kind of have to do a little a mini spectacle for these kind of things. And I also saw kind of how Lumpenproletariat are used against struggling proletarians or Lumpenproletarians, because basically the slumlord got this basically got this drunk homeless guy to harass us. And one of the more lumping guys who was there on the picket line with us took out his cane and beat the shit out of him, and it got really ugly. But it was just interesting to me how you see a lot of the same dynamics you were talking about with the Lumpen. Obviously, this was not, I didn't have nearly as much experience, but I just thought it was an interesting parallel with a lot of stuff that you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm showing the beautiful pictures, which kind of has the effect of making it seem bigger than it was. But anyway, but were you threatened then in this situation?
Oh yeah, the guy he came, he was looking for a fight, and it was obvious that he was basically just maybe the slumlord threw him some money and told him to go harass us.
Oh yeah. I know.
It's just, and a lot of people in the apartment complex wanted nothing to do with it. They were very suspicious of us, and so there's just all these cultural we were all petty bourgeois students. And
yeah. I know what you mean.
Below, but we were able to organize with them, and they had massive respect for us, and they were very
I know what you mean. Most people do, they like it. They feel it like a kind of compromise, political compromise, which it actually is. But there are some people inside there that runs counter to it. I get the feeling that there is this kind of relation to bourgeois democracy, to criminality and banditism. That is, I don't mean in the naive sense that, when you have democracy, you have too much liberty and people do crime. It's not what I mean. What I mean is, in order to have bourgeois democracy, there are lots of compromises that you have to do. I mean, Marx analyzes is in the 18th Brumaire. Some compromises are territorial, for bourgeois democracy to work, there needs to be some territory shadows in which no state, no policy, no anything works. And what works as a law is violence, pure and simple violence. And this is not, as usual, a mere coincidence, but it works systematically as a kind of dissuasion effect for us. Yes, of course, we go there, we try to mobilize them, but we get threatened from these guys. I think the most serious case when I really thought of running away was this guy. His name was Johnny. He's dead now. he really didn't like us. He really didn't like us. So one day we did an assembly at 10 o'clock at night, and he killed a guy like 5 meters in front of us and run away. There was like visitors, supporters with us. It was total situation. My God, you can imagine how we felt. But then, you know, he was such a problematic guy that he got into a fight with another guy and he was killed. But yeah, it's kind of very hard stuff. At the same time, he cannot deal with it alone. Like we, of course, are always respectful. And in the end, we always had this idea that if any conflict arises, we simply go out. And we were very frank with the people. Listen, we don't carry guns. We're not bandits. We're here because we think that you want our help. If you don't, we just leave it and we go. But they kind of get scary of this perspective, because precisely I see that it's, you know, it's not like this debate on left lumpen, right lumpen, honest lumpen, or criminal lumpen. It's very difficult to trace these differences. So these criminal lumpens, they need the honest lumpens in order for them to survive. So it's like we go away, all the occupations would go away, and they would get, you know, only the criminals in the middle of an empty place. It's no business for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in real life situations, those kind of categories start to break down. You know, someone might be an honest lumpen proletarian one day, but
yeah. Exactly.
Okay, my friends, this has been a fabulous evening. Thanks for coming out and spending it with us. I want to thank Donald and Chris Santo for their presentations. I really think, you know, this has been an immersion into the problem of lumpen proletariat, which, I mean, just, you know, since we started, I've learned a lot more personally. So that's why we do these things. And I hope that you all learned a lot in the process, and that it was helpful for your own respective research as well. So we'll share the video for the good of the wider group that's interested in it. And thanks also to Cosmonaut for partnering with this. I thought it was a lot of fun, and hopefully Clyde Barrow is not freezing to death in Texas.
yeah.
I was thinking about him. I got to check in to see if he's all right. He told us he's going to give the honorarium to the local food bank, which is a nice gesture. And I just confirmed our next seminar with a really exciting Lacanian feminist. Really excited. I'll share the name later, but she's kind of semi-famous person, and somebody who is really like an excellent teacher of Lacan. So for those of you interested in psychoanalysis, you're gonna want to attend this one, I think. Okay, all the best. Be well, and I wish you a good night.
Good night. Yeah.
Thanks again, Cristiano.
Yeah, good night, guys. It was a great time. I had a great time talking.
Yeah. Me too.
Fun.
Yeah.
Peace out, everybody. Thank you. Bye.